October 14th, 2023. That's the date everything I thought I knew about folklore and reality changed. It started as a simple trip to my grandmother's hometown in Mexico, a place I'd only heard about in her stories. But what I encountered there, it's something I'll carry with me forever. The village was called San Pedro de las Fuentes. I arrived that afternoon, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and blooming marigolds. My grandmother had passed away a month earlier, and it fell to me to sort through her belongings. Her house, perched at the edge of the Rio Santiago, seemed to breathe with memories. Its faded walls bore the weight of countless years, and the river, dark and sluggish, seemed almost alive. People in the village were welcoming, but guarded. At the market, as I picked up some fruit, an elderly woman approached me. She looked at me with piercing eyes and asked, "You're Elena's grandson, aren't you?" When I nodded, her expression turned grave. She leaned in close and whispered, "Don't go near the river after sunset. She's been heard. You understand? Stay inside." I laughed nervously, chalking it up to superstition, but her words stayed with me. That night, October 14th, at exactly 11:47 p.m., I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, too quiet, and the river seemed to hum in the distance. I stepped out onto the porch, the cool night air biting against my skin. The stars were bright and the moon cast an eerie glow on the landscape. And then I heard it, a cry. Faint at first, like a child's whimper, but it grew louder, more agonized. It was the sound of a heart breaking, raw and piercing. My blood ran cold. Against every instinct, I found myself drawn toward the river. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but deep down, I knew better. The path to the river felt endless, the trees closing in around me. The crying grew louder with every step, pulling me forward. When I reached the bank, I saw her, a woman in white standing in the water. Her long black hair obscured her face, and her shoulders trembled with silent sobs. My voice felt stuck in my throat, but I managed to call out, "Señora, está bien?" She didn't respond. Slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes, they weren't eyes at all, but hollow pits of darkness. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and her teeth, sharp, glinting in the moonlight. She let out a wail so unearthly, so filled with despair that I fell to my knees. My chest felt like it was caving in, my breath ripped away by the sound. She began to move toward me, her feet skimming the surface of the water. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the trees blurring past me. Her cries followed, growing louder, more frantic. The night seemed endless, the village a labyrinth. When I finally reached my grandmother's house, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Inside, I found an old notebook on the table. My grandmother's handwriting filled the pages, detailing encounters with La Llorona dating back decades. She'd known. She'd tried to warn me, but I hadn't listened. The cries outside eventually faded, but their echo remained, etched into my mind. October 15th, 6:12 a.m. The first rays of sunlight broke through the window as I packed my bags. I left the village on the earliest bus, the road winding away from the river and the memories I'd rather forget. But forgetting isn't so easy. Even now, I sometimes hear her cries, faint and distant, carried on the wind. They say La Llorona chooses who sees her, that her curse binds her to the soul she touches. I don't know why she appeared to me, but one thing is certain. If you ever hear her cries, stay away from the river. Don't follow the sound, because once she's seen you, you're never truly free. Have you heard her yet? Growing up, I'd heard the tale of La Llorona countless times. A woman who, in an act of unimaginable despair, drowned her children in a river. Some say it was revenge on a faithless husband. Others claim it was madness. Whatever the reason, her punishment was eternal, roaming the earth, crying for the children she lost. The stories were always told in hushed tones, usually around a campfire or late at night when shadows danced on the walls. Parents used it as a cautionary tale. "Don't wander near the river after dark," they'd say, "or La Llorona will take you." As a child, I believed it was just a way to keep us from straying too far from home. But as I got older, I began to hear whispers, stories from people who swore they'd seen her. Their accounts were chilling, far too vivid to dismiss as mere folklore. One man claimed he'd been fishing by the river at dusk when he heard a woman sobbing. He called out to her, but when she turned, her face was a hollow mask of anguish. Another woman said she'd seen La Llorona standing at the edge of her bed, her mournful cries filling the room. These weren't just stories meant to scare children. They were warnings passed down through generations. Still, I dismissed them. Ghost stories, I thought, nothing more. But that changed on October 14th, 2023. That was the day I learned the truth. The day I realized La Llorona wasn't just a story. She was real. I arrived in San Pedro de las Fuentes, a small village nestled by the Rio Santiago. It was October 13th, late afternoon. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across cobblestone streets. The air was thick, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and something floral, almost sweet. The town was cloaked in an eerie stillness, as if time itself had slowed down here. My grandmother's house stood at the edge of the village, perched on a small hill overlooking the river. It was a striking sight. A weathered structure with faded blue walls and a tiled roof that seemed to sag under the weight of its years. The windows were shrouded by lace curtains, and the front door creaked as I pushed it open, almost as if it were protesting my arrival. Inside, the air was cool, and the faint smell of lavender lingered, a comforting reminder of her presence. As I wandered through the village that evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The townspeople were kind but guarded, their smiles polite but strained. Whenever I mentioned my plans to visit the river, their expressions shifted. Eyes flickered with something unspoken, a shadow of fear or perhaps pity. One man, an elderly vendor selling candles, grasped my wrist as I picked up a purchase. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Be careful near the water," he said. "It's not safe after dark." I tried to dismiss it as small-town superstition, but the unease in his eyes stayed with me. The village itself seemed to breathe with secrets, every corner and alley whispering stories I wasn't meant to hear. That night, as the sky darkened and the river's murmur reached my ears through the open window, I began to understand. San Pedro de las Fuentes was more than just a quiet village. It was a place where legends lived, woven into the very fabric of its existence. That evening, I wandered into the local market. It was October 13th, 6:43 p.m. The sky had begun to dim, casting a golden hue over the bustling stalls. The market was alive with vibrant colours, brightly painted pottery, woven textiles, and stacks of fresh produce. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted corn and spices, a comforting blend that momentarily eased the tension I'd felt since arriving. As I sifted through a pile of ripe tomatoes, an elderly woman approached me. Her face was deeply lined, her skin weathered from years under the sun. Her hands, trembling slightly, clutched a small woven basket. She stopped just a few feet away, her sharp eyes fixed on mine. "You're the grandson of Elena, aren't you?" she asked, her voice low but steady. For a moment, I was taken aback. The way she said my grandmother's name felt heavy, almost reverent. I nodded, and her expression darkened. "You must listen to me," she said, stepping closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the market. "Don't go near the river after sunset." Her eyes darted around as if she feared someone might overhear. "She's been heard. You understand? Stay inside. Promise me." I forced a nervous laugh, trying to lighten the mood. "I'll be careful," I said, though the seriousness in her tone unsettled me. She reached out and gripped my wrist, her fingers surprisingly strong. "This isn't a joke, child. Promise me," she insisted. Her eyes bore into mine, filled with something between fear and desperation. I finally nodded. "I promise," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. She released my wrist, her gaze lingering for a moment before she turned and disappeared into the crowd. I told myself it was just superstition, an old legend that had grown into an obsession for some. But as I made my way back to my grandmother's house, her words echoed in my mind. "Don't go near the river after sunset." The way she said it, as if the river itself was alive, as if it was watching and waiting, sent a chill down my spine. By the time I reached the house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were beginning to appear. The river's murmur was louder now, almost melodic, yet somehow menacing. I locked the door behind me, trying to shake the unease that had settled deep in my chest. But no matter how much I tried, her warning lingered, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. October 14th, 11:47 p.m. I couldn't sleep. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every creak and whisper. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and a strange unease gnawed at me, as if I was being watched. I tossed and turned, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Finally, I decided to step outside and clear my head. The porch was cool beneath my bare feet. The night sky was a blanket of stars, but it offered little comfort. The only sound was the faint murmur of the Rio Santiago, its gentle flow barely audible over the stillness. For a moment I stood there, trying to convince myself that everything was fine, that I was imagining things. And then I heard it. A cry. Faint at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. It sent a shiver down my spine. I strained to listen, hoping it was just an animal or the wind playing tricks on me. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just a cry, it was a wail, a sound filled with raw, unfiltered anguish. It was the sound of a mother mourning her child. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The stories I'd heard as a child came rushing back. La Llorona, the weeping woman. But this couldn't be real. It couldn't. My rational mind screamed at me to go back inside, to lock the door and stay put. But something else, something deeper, compelled me to stay. It wasn't curiosity. It was a pull, an inexplicable force that drew me toward the river. I stepped off the porch, my movements slow and hesitant. The grass was damp beneath my feet, and the cool night air bit at my skin. As I got closer to the river, the cries grew louder, more desperate. My chest tightened with fear, but I couldn't stop. It was as if the sound had taken hold of me, guiding my steps against my will. The river came into view, its dark waters shimmering faintly under the starlight. And then I saw her. A figure standing at the edge of the water, her back to me. She was draped in white, her long hair cascading down her back like a river of shadows. She stood perfectly still, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I wanted to call out, to ask if she needed help, but the words caught in my throat. Every instinct told me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and fascination. And then she turned. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark voids, endless and empty. She opened her mouth, and the wail that escaped was unlike anything I'd ever heard. It was a sound that tore through me, filling me with a sorrow so profound it felt like it might crush me. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Somehow, I found the strength to turn and run. The house wasn't far, but every step felt like a mile. I didn't stop until I was inside. The door locked behind me. My hands were trembling, my heart racing. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the door, half expecting her to burst through it. But she didn't. The only sound was the pounding of my own heartbeat and the faint echo of her cries, lingering in my ears long after they had faded into the night. October 14th, 11:53 p.m. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light casting silver streaks across the dark waters of the Rio Santiago. The night was unnervingly quiet. The only sound, the soft rustling of the trees and the faint murmur of the river. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the curve in the river where the sound seemed to be coming from. Each step felt heavier than the last, the pull of curiosity and fear battling within me. And then I saw her. A woman dressed in white, standing ankle-deep in the water. The fabric of her dress shimmered faintly in the moonlight, clinging to her as if it were part of her very being. Her hair was long and dark, cascading down her back in wild waves, obscuring her face entirely. Her shoulders shook with the force of her sobs, the sound raw and heart-wrenching, piercing through the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat. The stories had described her perfectly, but seeing her, here, now, was something else entirely. She felt real, tangible, and yet there was an otherworldly quality to her presence that made my skin prickle. I forced myself to speak, my voice trembling. "Señora, está bien?" The words felt small, almost meaningless, swallowed by the vastness of the night. For a moment, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the world itself had paused, waiting. She didn't turn, didn't move. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that sinks deep into your bones. I took a hesitant step closer, every fiber of my being screaming at me to turn back. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried an undeniable weight. "Miss Hijos," she said. The words hung in the air, filled with a sorrow so profound it made my chest ache. Her sobs resumed, louder this time, more desperate. It was as if she was reliving the pain of a loss too great to bear. I stood there, frozen, torn between the instinct to flee and the inexplicable need to understand. The stories had always been just that, stories. But now, as I stood on the banks of the Rio Santiago, face to face with the legend herself, I realized there was truth in them. And that truth was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. October 14th, 11:56 p.m. I couldn't breathe. The night seemed to hold its breath with me as I stood frozen by the riverbank, staring at her trembling form. Then she turned, slowly, deliberately. Her face, I can barely describe it. Her eyes were hollow, black pits, voids that seemed to pull in all the light around them, leaving nothing but darkness. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque shape, an unnatural contortion that spoke of unimaginable pain. And then she opened it, revealing teeth, far too sharp, far too numerous. It was as though her very form defied the natural order, a manifestation of grief and rage made flesh. My legs felt like lead, but instinct took over. I stumbled back, tripping over a root hidden in the shadows. The ground was hard and cold beneath me, but I barely noticed the pain. My eyes were locked on hers, those empty, endless voids that seemed to see through me, into me. And then she wailed. It wasn't human. It was a sound that clawed at my very soul, primal and raw, filled with despair so deep it felt like the earth itself would crack under the weight of it. My ears rang, my chest tightened, and for a moment I thought I might be sick. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it over her cries. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. She took a step forward, her movements fluid yet unnatural, as though the air itself bent around her. The chill in the air deepened, sinking into my bones. I couldn't look away, trapped in her gaze, unable to move, unable to think. I wanted to scream, but no sound would come. It was as if she had stolen my voice, my strength, my very will to resist. And then, just as suddenly as it began, she stopped. Her wail faded into the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. She tilted her head as if studying me, her expression unreadable. I don't know how long we stood there, locked in that moment, but it felt like an eternity. Then she turned back toward the river, her form dissolving into the mist as if she had never been there at all. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint trickle of the water and the frantic beating of my heart. I was alone again, but the terror lingered, etched into my very being. I knew, without a doubt, that I had just come face to face with La Llorona. October 14th, 11:58 p.m. I didn't think it could get worse, but it did. As she turned back toward me, her form became sharper, more defined, as if feeding off my terror. Then she moved. No, she glided. Her feet never touched the ground, her body eerily still as she floated toward me over the water. Panic surged through me, breaking the paralysis that had gripped my body moments before. I scrambled to my feet, my breaths ragged and shallow, and I ran. My heart hammered in my chest, every beat echoing in my ears as I bolted up the path. The way back to my grandmother's house felt endless, the shadows stretching and warping, the trees pressing in around me like dark sentinels. Her cries followed. They grew louder, more desperate, reverberating through the forest. It wasn't just sound, it was a force, an almost physical weight that bore down on me with every step. I glanced over my shoulder, regretting it instantly. She was closer now, her form a blur of white and darkness, her face obscured by her wild hair, but no less terrifying. The air itself seemed to conspire against me, thickening around my legs as though the night were alive, determined to trap me. My foot caught on a root, and I stumbled, crashing to the ground. Pain shot up my arm, but I barely felt it. Adrenaline pushed me forward. I scrambled to my feet, my eyes darting wildly, searching for any sign of safety, any break in the suffocating darkness. The house was ahead. Its faint outline appeared through the trees, a beacon in the chaos. I pushed harder, every muscle screaming in protest, every instinct screaming to survive. Her cries pierced the air again, sharp and raw, as though she could sense my escape. They were closer now, impossibly close, and I swore I felt the icy touch of her presence at my back. I reached the porch, my fingers fumbling with the door. The wood felt rough and solid beneath my hands, grounding me just enough to twist the handle and throw myself inside. I slammed the door shut, pressing my weight against it, my chest heaving, my entire body trembling. The cries stopped. Silence fell, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the sound of my own labored breathing. I waited, heart racing, ears straining for any hint of her presence. But there was nothing. Just the quiet, suffocating stillness of the night. I knew she was still out there somewhere, watching, waiting, and I knew this wasn't over. October 15th, 12:14 a.m. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of my own labored breathing. My hands trembled as I clutched the rosary tighter, the beads digging into my palm as if tethering me to reality. My grandmother's presence lingered in the room, not in the comforting way I'd remembered, but in the heavy, foreboding air that seemed to wrap itself around me. That's when I saw it. The notebook. Its cracked leather cover was familiar, something I'd seen her holding countless times but had never thought to open. It lay on the table, out of place among the otherwise untouched belongings, almost as though it had been left there deliberately, waiting for me. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. The cries outside had stopped, but their echo still reverberated through my mind. Slowly, I reached for the book, my fingers brushing over its worn surface. It felt warm, almost alive, and for a moment I wondered if I was losing my grip on reality. I opened it. The pages were brittle, filled with my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, sharp, deliberate, and oddly hurried in places. The first entry was dated November 3rd, 1967. It described a cold autumn night, the sound of crying, and a figure by the river. The details mirrored my own encounter so closely that it felt like I was reading my own story, told decades before I was even born. Entry after entry chronicled sightings, warnings, and prayers, each more desperate than the last. My grandmother had lived in constant fear of La Llorona, her life entwined with the legend in ways I could barely comprehend. There were sketches, too, crude but haunting. The woman in white, her hollow eyes, her twisted smile. The words beneath one drawing stood out, written in thick, uneven strokes. She comes for those who hear her. My chest tightened as I turned to the final page. The entry was dated October 2nd, 2023, just days before her passing. Her writing was shaky, almost illegible, but one phrase was clear. She is closer now. I pray she spares him. The weight of her words hit me like a tidal wave. She had known. Not just about La Llorona, but about me, about the role I was destined to play in this cursed story. The rosary slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the table. My vision blurred as tears welled up, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly, utterly helpless. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. For a fleeting moment, I thought I heard her again. Soft, distant, but unmistakable. I closed the notebook and sat there, staring at the door, knowing that even if I left this village, even if I crossed oceans, I would never escape her. Because La Llorona doesn't just haunt rivers, she haunts those who have seen her. And once you've heard her cries, she is with you, always. October 15th, 6:12 a.m. The village was still asleep when I stepped onto the bus, its old engines sputtering to life in the cold morning air. I kept my head low, avoiding the gaze of the driver and the few early risers who had come to see off loved ones. My hands shook as I handed over the fare, the rosary still wrapped tightly around my fingers like a lifeline. The bus groaned forward, and the village faded into the distance. Its quiet streets and looming river swallowed by the rising fog. I couldn't bring myself to look back. Not at the house, not at the river, not at the place where my life had changed in ways I was still struggling to understand. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light over the mountains. For a moment I closed my eyes, hoping to feel the warmth of its rays, to feel anything that could chase away the cold that had settled deep in my bones. But the chill remained, a constant reminder of what I had seen, of what I had heard. Even now, I can't explain why she appeared to me. Was it a warning, a curse, or was it something deeper, something I wasn't meant to understand? I've asked myself that question every day since, and I still have no answer. Sometimes, late at night, I hear her, not as clearly as I did by the river, but faintly, as if carried on the wind. A soft, mournful cry that makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I tell myself it's just my imagination, the lingering echo of a nightmare that refuses to fade. But deep down, I know better. I wonder if she's searching for her children, or if she's searching for me. Because once she's seen you, once her cries have reached you, she never truly lets you go. And so I live with the weight of that night, the memories etched into my mind like scars. I left San Pedro de las Fuentes, but La Llorona, she never left me. They say La Llorona only appears to those she chooses, her sorrow drawn to certain souls like a moth to flame. Perhaps it's those who wander too close to grief, or those whose fates are already tangled in hers. She doesn't come to just anyone. Her presence is deliberate. Her cries are summons that few ever live to recount. If you ever hear her, those faint, mournful cries carried on the wind, heed this warning. Do not follow them. Do not step toward the water, no matter how harmless it may seem. Turn away. Lock your doors. Pray she doesn't call your name. Because once she's seen you, once her hollow eyes have pierced through the veil of your existence, you will never be free. Her sorrow clings to you like a shadow, her cries echoing in the quietest corners of your mind. They say La Llorona mourns for her children, but perhaps she mourns for something greater, a torment so deep it cannot be named. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of a river, staring into the darkness where her figure might emerge, remember this: she is more than a story. She is waiting, watching. So, if you hear her cries, run, because escaping her is impossible. And once you've crossed her path, you'll understand. She doesn't just haunt rivers, she haunts you. Have you heard her yet?